the Poison King, the man who spent his life drinking venom and couldn't die when he wanted it to. Did you know that one of Rome's most feared enemies spent his entire life drinking small amounts of poison every single day, not to die, but to make himself impossible to kill? Kingdom of Pontus, 120 BC. A boy watched his father die from poisoned wine at a banquet, and he decided that would never happen to him. So he ran into the wilderness, studied every toxic plant and venom known to exist, and built the world's first antidote. He became immune to poison. He defeated Rome 3 times. And then, when he finally wanted to die rather than be captured, the poison he swallowed did absolutely nothing. His own life's work had made him unkillable. The Kingdom of Pontus sits along the southern coast of the Black Sea, the region that is today northern Turkey. In 120 BC, it is a prosperous and strategically important kingdom, positioned at the intersection of Greek civilization, Persian tradition, and the expanding reach of Rome. Its king, Mithridates VI, rules with considerable success until the night a banquet ends with his sudden death. The cause, according to the historical sources, was poison in his wine. His son, also named Mithridates, is approximately 12 years old when his father dies. According to the ancient historical accounts preserved by Appian, Plutarch, and Justin, the young prince immediately suspects that his own mother, acting as regent, may have been involved in his father's death. Whether that suspicion was accurate, the historical record cannot confirm. But the effect on the boy was permanent and defining. He had watched the most powerful man in his world die from a substance small enough to dissolve invisibly in a cup of wine. And he understood, with the clarity that childhood trauma produces, that he was next. According to the historical sources, the young Mithridates did something extraordinary in response to this fear. He did not simply surround himself with guards or food tasters, though he would later do both. He disappeared. He fled the palace and the city of Sinope and went into the wilderness of the Pontic Mountains, the heavily forested, rugged highlands of his kingdom's interior, where he lived, according to the ancient accounts, for approximately 7 years. 7 years alone, or nearly alone, in the wilderness. The ancient sources describe a young man who used this time with a specific and obsessive purpose, learning everything that could be learned about poison, which plants were toxic, which animals carried venom, which combinations of substances produced which effects, and the crucial insight that would define his entire life: how small doses of a harmful substance, taken repeatedly over time, could train the body to resist larger doses. The concept that Mithridates was developing during his years in the wilderness is today known as hormesis, the biological principle that low doses of a stressor can stimulate adaptive responses that increase an organism's resistance to higher doses of the same stressor. In modern toxicology, hormesis is a recognized and studied phenomenon. In 120 BC, Mithridates arrived at a functional understanding of it through direct experimentation on his own body. According to the ancient accounts, he began consuming small quantities of various toxic substances, plant extracts, venoms, compounds from animals known to be poisonous, in doses too small to cause serious harm. Gradually, over months and years, he increased the doses. His body adapted. The threshold at which a given substance would produce serious effects rose progressively. He was, in the language of modern pharmacology, up-regulating his own detoxification pathways and building tolerance to multiple toxic compounds simultaneously. The ancient sources also describe him studying the animals of the Pontic wilderness, with specific attention to creatures that consumed toxic plants without apparent harm. Certain ducks and geese, feeding on plants poisonous to most animals, were noted by ancient naturalists, including Pliny the Elder, as sources of blood that had acquired toxic properties from the diet, a phenomenon that ancient sources associate specifically with the Mithridates tradition. The king reportedly incorporated the blood of these birds into his antidote formulations, reasoning that animals that consumed poison had developed some protective factor that could be transferred. During these years, Mithridates also developed the linguistic and intellectual capabilities that would make him one of the most formidable rulers of his era. Ancient sources credit him with fluency in 22 languages, a claim that scholars debate but that reflects a genuine tradition of his exceptional intellectual capacity. He was simultaneously building physical toughness through the hardships of wilderness life and intellectual sophistication through systematic study of natural philosophy and medicine. When he returned to Sinope, he was no longer a frightened boy. He was a young man with a specific plan, a specific capability, and a specific score to settle. Back in power, having removed his mother and younger brother from authority through means the ancient sources describe with notable brevity, Mithridates turned his palace into a research laboratory. The antidote he had been developing in the wilderness was refined in his royal court with resources unavailable to a boy living rough in the mountains. The formulation known as Mithridatium, the universal antidote, became one of the most famous pharmaceutical preparations in the ancient world. According to ancient sources including Pliny the Elder and the physician Galen, the preparation contained approximately 65 ingredients. The list included opium, which Galen later analyzed as the preparation's most pharmacologically active component, along with honey, various plant extracts including rue and fennel, mineral substances, and a range of spices and resins from across the known world. The opium content is medically significant. Opium contains alkaloids, including morphine, that have real and measurable effects on pain perception and physiological stress response. A preparation containing opium would genuinely make a person feel better after exposure to many toxic substances simply by reducing the pain and distress response, which would, from the ancient perspective, appear as evidence of antidotal effectiveness. The preparation was not entirely without active mechanisms, even if those mechanisms were different from what Mithridates believed. To test his formulations, Mithridates used condemned prisoners, people already sentenced to death in his kingdom's judicial system. According to the historical sources, including Pliny's account, he administered various poisons to these prisoners, and then attempted to treat them with his antidote, observing the outcomes carefully. This was, by modern ethical standards, deeply problematic. Within the moral framework of the ancient world, it was simply the application of available resources to a research question. The formulation he arrived at became his most prized possession, a substance he consumed daily, believing it to be the foundation of his immunity. Mithridates VI became king of Pontus around 15 BC and ruled for approximately half a century, one of the longer reigns of any ruler in the turbulent political landscape of the late Hellenistic world. During this reign, his reputation for immunity to poison became both a political tool and a personal performance. According to the ancient sources, Mithridates would on occasion demonstrate his immunity publicly, consuming substances at banquets that he allowed his court to understand were dangerous, and suffering no apparent ill effects. Whether these demonstrations involved genuinely lethal substances or carefully calibrated non-lethal doses is impossible to verify, but the political effect was clear. A king who could not be poisoned was a king who could not be killed by the most common and most deniable method of political assassination in the ancient world. Every meal that reached Mithridates' table went through an elaborate inspection process. Food tasters checked everything before it reached him. But the king himself understood that no food tasting protocol was ultimately reliable. A sufficiently clever poisoner could target him in ways that a taster would not detect. His daily dose of Mithridatium was his real insurance, not the taster's. The paranoia that accompanied this level of threat awareness shaped every aspect of his court. The ancient sources describe a ruler who trusted almost no one completely, not his wives, of whom he had multiple, not his children, not his closest advisors. Several members of his own family died by his order when he suspected them of plotting against him. His mother and brother, who had held power during his minority, lost their positions when he returned to claim his throne. Later, wives and concubines he suspected of infidelity or treachery were executed. The psychology of a man who cannot be killed by poison, but can be betrayed by the people around him, is a specific and claustrophobic psychology. Every relationship was potentially a threat. Every gesture of affection was potentially a deception. The antidote that protected his body did nothing to protect him from the particular vulnerability of a man who had trained himself to trust nothing. Rome and Mithridates VI collided inevitably. The expansion of Roman power into Asia Minor, the territory that is now Western Turkey, brought the growing empire into direct conflict with a kingdom whose ruler had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of existential threat. The conflict that historians call the Mithridatic Wars, 3 separate wars fought over approximately 25 years, made Mithridates the most persistently dangerous enemy Rome faced during the late Republic. He defeated Roman forces multiple times, he formed alliances across the Mediterranean, and in 88 BC he orchestrated what the ancient sources call the Asiatic Vespers, a coordinated massacre in which approximately 80,000 Roman citizens and Italian traders living across Asia Minor were killed in a single day, in response to what Mithridates characterized as Roman oppression of local populations. 80,000 people killed in a single day. The scale of this act, and its coordination across multiple cities simultaneously, demonstrated a level of organizational capacity and ruthlessness that shocked Rome and secured Mithridates' place as the empire's most feared external enemy. He also used poison as a weapon of war in ways that represent some of the earliest documented examples of chemical warfare in history. According to ancient sources, Mithridates deployed honey produced by bees that had fed on toxic plants, specifically rhododendron species whose nectar produces a toxin called grey anotoxin, as a weapon against Roman forces. The soldiers, encountering large quantities of honey left apparently unguarded, consumed it and experienced the disorienting effects of grey anotoxin poisoning: vomiting, weakness, inability to stand or fight. The Roman forces were then attacked while incapacitated. This was not accidental. It was deliberate, planned, and effective. The king, who had spent his life studying poison, was now using that knowledge as military strategy. The daily routine of Mithridates VI, as described in the ancient sources and reconstructed by modern historians of ancient medicine, was organized around his antidote practice in ways that shaped his entire life. Every morning, before eating anything else, he consumed his Mithridatium preparation. The dose was calibrated carefully, enough to maintain and reinforce his tolerance, not enough to produce significant physiological disturbance. The specific toxic substances that Mithridates habitually consumed as part of his immunity-building regimen are described in ancient sources with varying levels of specificity. Pliny the Elder mentions arsenic as one of the substances Mithridates worked with. Arsenic tolerance can indeed be built through chronic low-dose exposure. The mechanism involves upregulation of the body's arsenic methylation and excretion pathways, essentially training the liver to process the substance more efficiently. Communities in various parts of the world have historically developed partial tolerance to environmental arsenic exposure through exactly this mechanism. The body's primary detoxification organ for most toxic substances is the liver, which contains enzyme systems specifically designed to process and neutralize compounds that would otherwise be harmful. The cytochrome P450 enzyme family, in particular, can be induced, upregulated, by chronic low-level exposure to various substances, produce increased capacity to metabolize those substances. This is the biological mechanism behind the tolerance that Mithridates was empirically developing, without any knowledge of the molecular biology involved. Modern toxicologists who have examined the Mithridates case note that genuine immunity to all poisons is not biologically possible. Different poisons work through fundamentally different mechanisms, some by interfering with nerve signal transmission, some by damaging cell membranes, some by blocking oxygen transport, some by disrupting enzyme function. No single physiological adaptation can protect against all of these mechanisms simultaneously. What Mithridates could have developed was genuine tolerance to specific substances he had regularly consumed. The universal antidote he believed he had created was almost certainly not universal. The formula for Mithridatium, the antidote that Mithridates considered his greatest achievement and his most essential protection. survived his death because Roman General Pompey captured it along with the king's other documents when Pontus was finally conquered. Pompey had the formula translated into Latin and brought to Rome, where it entered the Roman medical tradition and was studied, modified, and used by physicians for nearly 2,000 years. The Roman physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century AD, analyzed the Mithridateum formula in detail and produced his own improved version. Galen's analysis identified opium as the preparation's most pharmacologically significant component and provided a rational explanation for why the preparation might reduce the effects of certain poisons. The analgesic and sedative effects of opium would reduce the physiological stress response to toxic exposure, potentially improving survival outcomes in some poisoning cases. The preparation evolved over centuries into a formulation called theriac, which became the universal panacea of medieval European and Islamic medicine. Theriac was prescribed for everything from poisoning to plague to general debility, and it remained in European pharmacopoeias, formal official lists of approved medicines, until the 19th century. The connection between the medieval panacea used by European physicians as late as 1800 AD and the wilderness experiments of a Pontic king in 120 BC is direct and documented. The 65 ingredients of the original Mithridateum included substances that modern pharmacology recognizes as having real biological activity: opium, various plant alkaloids, mineral compounds, alongside substances whose inclusion reflected magical and symbolic thinking rather than empirical observation. The mixture of genuine empirical insight and pre-scientific belief that characterizes the Mithridateum is typical of ancient medicine more broadly, and the formula's long survival in the medical tradition reflects both the genuine utility of some of its components and the enormous authority that Mithridates' reputation conferred on anything associated with his name. The mind of Mithridates VI, as it can be reconstructed from the ancient sources, presents one of the most psychologically complex portraits in ancient history. This was a man of genuinely extraordinary capability, a military commander who defeated Roman forces multiple times, a linguist who communicated directly with peoples across his multilingual empire, a scientist who made real contributions to the understanding of toxicology, whose capabilities were continuously warped by a foundational fear that never left him. The fear of poison, of invisible death delivered through food or drink without warning, without any possibility of defense except his own physiological preparation, shaped every human relationship he attempted to maintain. The ancient sources describe multiple instances of Mithridates executing wives, concubines, and family members he suspected of plotting against him. His eldest son Mithridates the Younger was executed on suspicion of conspiracy. Several of his wives died by his order or were forced to take their own lives. This is the paradox at the center of his life. He built the most sophisticated individual poison defense system in the ancient world. He invested decades in making his body resistant to assassination. And yet the thing he most feared, betrayal, the intimate treachery of people close to him, was not something that any antidote could address. His Mithridateum protected him from the cup. It could not protect him from his own son. Modern psychiatric analysis of the historical portrait of Mithridates would likely identify features consistent with what contemporary psychology calls persecutory delusional thinking, an extreme and distorting conviction that one is being targeted for harm that, in Mithridates' case, was not entirely delusional. People genuinely were trying to kill him. His father had been poisoned. His mother may have been involved in that poisoning. His entire political environment was genuinely dangerous. The difficulty is that the genuine danger and the psychological response to it became indistinguishable, and the precautions he took against real threats eventually destroyed the relationships that might have given him something worth protecting. By 63 BC, everything had collapsed. The Third Mithridatic War had gone decisively against him. The Roman general Pompey, who would become one of the dominant figures of the late Republic, had defeated his armies and driven him from Pontus entirely. Mithridates retreated north to the Crimean Peninsula on the northern shore of the Black Sea, where he still controlled territory and harboured plans for one final campaign against Rome, this time marching west through Europe with a new army recruited from the peoples of the steppe. Those plans never materialized. His own son, Pharnaces II, led a revolt among the troops at Panticapaeum, the capital of the Crimean Bosporan kingdom, that Mithridates had made his final refuge. The soldiers, exhausted by decades of warfare and unconvinced by the plans for yet another campaign, sided with Pharnaces. Mithridates found himself surrounded by his own former army, in his own final citadel, with no path to escape and no prospect of rescue. According to Appian's account, the most detailed surviving ancient narrative of these final moments, Mithridates made the decision that any man of his background and beliefs would have made in this situation. He was not going to be taken to Rome in chains, displayed in Pompey's triumph, and executed as a spectacle for the Roman crowd. He would die on his own terms, by his own hand, in his own time. He gave poison to his daughters first, who were with him in the citadel, and who he did not want to fall into Roman hands. They died. Then he drank his own antidote, or rather his own poison preparation, the most lethal compound he had available, the substance he had spent a lifetime studying and working with. And he waited. Nothing happened. His body, trained over 5 decades to process and neutralize toxic compounds, processed this one too. The poison that had killed his daughters did nothing to him. He tried again. Still nothing. The final scene of Mithridates VI's life is one of history's most extraordinary ironies, and Appian records it with the kind of precise detail that suggests it was too strange to be invented. The king who had made himself immune to poison stood in his citadel, having swallowed enough poison to kill several ordinary men, feeling nothing. His daughters were dead, his army had betrayed him, his empire was gone, and his own greatest achievement, the physiological fortress he had spent his entire life constructing, had become his prison. He called for one of his Gallic bodyguards, a man named Bituitus, according to the ancient sources, and asked him to use his sword. Bituitus complied. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, ruler of 22 languages, master of toxicology, Rome's most persistent enemy for a quarter century, died by the blade because the poison would not take him. Pompey, upon receiving the news and later capturing Mithridates' documents and research, reportedly wept. A reaction the ancient sources connect to a combination of admiration for so formidable an enemy and relief that the war was finally over. The formula for Mithridatium was taken to Rome and translated, entering the Roman medical tradition and eventually becoming theriac, the universal antidote that European physicians would prescribe for nearly 2,000 years. The word Mithridatism entered the medical and scientific vocabulary as the term for the specific practice of building tolerance to a poison through graduated exposure. It is still used in modern toxicology. When researchers study acquired tolerance to chemical compounds, or when they discuss the hormetic dose-response relationship in pharmacology, they are working in a tradition that traces directly back to a frightened boy in the forests of Pontus, who decided that if poison could kill, then poison could also protect. His life was defined by a single fear that he turned into a science. The science outlasted everything else. The kingdom, the wars, the family he destroyed in his paranoia, the empire he nearly broke. 2,000 years after his death, his name still means the thing he made himself into.